beam snaps, not with the sharp crack of fresh timber, but with the wet, fibrous tear of wood that has carried too much weight through too many seasons. In the first months of 1657, Edo is a city balanced on wind and paper, dry air, open flame, tight streets, houses built from lattice, plaster, and breath. Then the fire takes hold. It moves faster than people can run. Roof to roof, block to block. The sound repeats until it stops meaning anything. Posts buckling, joints separating, whole neighborhoods folding into ember. By the time it ends, more than half the city is gone. The dead are counted in the tens of thousands, perhaps more than 100,000. What remains is ash, blackened tiles, warped iron fittings, and the skeletal outline of a wooden city that failed exactly as expected. This is not a story about craftsmanship or beauty. This is about survival in a place where the ground moves, the air burns, and the rain rots everything it touches. Welcome to Japan Rewind. Japan built so much from wood, not because wood was permanent, but because it failed differently. In an archipelago where earthquakes arrive without warning, where typhoons strike the coast year after year, where humid summers invite mold into every seam, permanence was not just unrealistic, it was dangerous. Stone walls trap moisture until they crack. Rigid masonry transfers seismic force instead of absorbing it. When the ground moves, stone collapses catastrophically. Wood bends, wood shifts, wood breaks into parts, and parts can be replaced. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was arithmetic. When cities burn repeatedly, when floods erase districts, when the earth refuses to stay still, you build with materials that can be rebuilt quickly and cheaply. You build knowing that destruction is not an exception. It is a certainty. The Great Fire of Meireki was not unique. Edo suffered dozens of major fires during the Tokugawa period, and many more smaller ones. Each time, the city's wooden fabric proved its value not by surviving, but by being replaceable. After Meireki, the hammering began almost immediately. Carpenters arrived from across the domain. Tools sharp, knowledge intact. New posts were raised, new joints cut, new frames assembled. The rebuilt city was not identical. Streets were widened, fire breaks inserted, temples relocated away from commercial cores. But it was still made of wood, and that was deliberate. Here is where the system reveals itself, because the secret was not the material. It was how the material was allowed to move. Japanese carpenters developed joinery systems where the structure's strength came primarily from interlocking geometry rather than metal fasteners. Mortise-and-tenon joints, scarf joints, wedges that could be tightened or released. A damaged beam could be removed without demolishing the building. A leaning post could be lifted, straightened, and reset. Buildings were not monoliths. They were assemblies. This logic extended beyond individual houses to the city itself. Standardized measurements, the ken, the tatami, created repeating modules. Townhouses, temples, and administrative buildings differed in scale, but not in logic. Vertical posts, horizontal beams, replaceable infill. When fire or earthquake destroyed part of a neighborhood, carpenters did not need to reinvent the structure. They reproduced known forms using known dimensions. The buildings were layered systems, each part running on a different clock. Some components lasted decades, others wore out quickly. Paper screens, tatami mats, plaster walls, and were replaced as a routine part of life. A building did not stand. It was continuously renewed. Wood did something else that stone could not. It allowed buildings to be worked on while they were still alive. A wooden structure could be adjusted without being dismantled. Posts could be shimmed. Beams could be tightened. Joints coaxed back into alignment as the ground settled and shifted beneath them. This mattered in a country where earthquakes were not rare events, but recurring conditions. After a major quake, buildings were inspected not only for collapse, but for distortion. Frames twisted slightly out of square. Roof lines dipped. Columns leaned just enough to be noticed. And then they were corrected. Carpenters did not replace entire houses after every earthquake. They rebalanced them, lifted sections, reset joinery, returned structures to service with minimal material loss. This created a fundamentally different relationship between people and buildings. Houses were not finished objects. They were ongoing negotiations between gravity, moisture, wood, and time. Stone offered no such compromise. When masonry cracked, it failed internally. When walls separated, they could not be pulled back together. Repair meant demolition or dangerous patchwork. Wood failed visibly, audibly, gradually. Creaks warned before collapse. Gaps signaled stress. Movement was readable. Damage announced itself early. Buildings were not allowed to drift quietly toward catastrophe. They were constantly intervened upon, nudged back into alignment through small, repeated acts of maintenance. This is why Japanese cities could absorb repeated shocks without losing their underlying form. The city flexed, settled, adjusted. Disaster was not the moment of failure. It was the moment the system revealed where attention had lapsed. Even the frame itself was not sacred. At Ise Shrine, the most important site in Shinto, the entire complex is dismantled and rebuilt every 20 years on an adjacent plot. Old timbers are burned or buried. New posts raised, new joints cut, new roofs assembled. This cycle has continued for more than a millennium. It is spiritual, openly, deliberately spiritual. And it also functions as an extreme form of scheduled maintenance. By rebuilding before decay can accumulate, the shrine avoids emergency repair and structural failure. Craft knowledge stays alive. Materials never approach the end of their usable life. The city worked the same way, just without the ceremony. After Meireki, Edo was redesigned not to prevent fire, but to control it. Open spaces, wider streets, compartmentalized districts. Wood remained the dominant material because the alternative, a stone city built with 17th century technology, would have been slower, more expensive, and less resilient. Stone required quarrying, transport, and specialized labor. The Tokugawa regime reserved it for foundations, castle bases, and select infrastructure. Wood was abundant. Forests of cedar and cypress could be harvested within decades. Timber moved easily by river and canal. Most importantly, wood was expendable. When disaster struck, buildings could be written off without bankrupting their owners or the state. Rebuilding took months, not years. That expendability shaped daily life. Walls were thin, partitions slid, paper screens transmitted sound and temperature. Privacy was social, not architectural. Heating was collective. Rooms opened in summer for airflow, then tightened in winter for warmth. Space was not fixed, it was adjusted. And when catastrophe struck, the response was not improvisation. After a fire, the city did not recover. It mobilized. The shogunate could requisition labor for major reconstruction. Carpentry networks scaled rapidly. Peasants provided unskilled labor During agricultural off-seasons, merchants supplied timber, tiles, and fittings through established supply chains. Disaster became a recurring economic engine. Entire industries existed on the assumption that buildings would burn and need replacement. Employment in construction trades was steady, precisely because destruction was expected. Households maintained their homes through constant minor repair, tatami replaced, plaster renewed, joinery adjusted. People lived knowing their houses would not last forever, and they planned accordingly. Valuables were portable, evacuation routes memorized, fire brigades organized by neighborhood, their equipment stored in wooden towers designed to be rebuilt when, not if, they were lost. The architecture shaped behavior. The behavior reinforced the system. Those environmental pressures have not disappeared. Japan still shakes. Typhoons still arrive. Humidity still rots. Modern buildings still favor flexibility over rigidity in seismic zones. Post and beam construction persists, now reinforced with steel connectors and engineered lumber. What has largely vanished is the repair culture. Modern buildings are designed to last longer, but fail all at once. Components are harder to replace individually. When failure comes, demolition replaces renewal. The guilds, apprenticeships, and rebuilding cycles that sustained traditional carpentry were disrupted by industrialization and urbanization. What remains is the insight that guided centuries of builders. In an unstable environment, resilience does not come from building things that last forever. It comes from building things that can be rebuilt quickly. The wooden cities of early modern Japan were not monuments to permanence. They were machines for survival. The beam snaps, the joint separates, the frame sags, but the tools are sharp, the lumber is seasoned, and the knowledge of how to begin again remains intact. In a world where everything eventually fails, this is what success looks like. If this exploration of Japan's wooden architecture gave you a new way of seeing the past, let us know in the comments. Like the video if you want more system-level histories like this one, and subscribe to Japan Rewind for stories that look beyond surface culture to the forces that actually shaped civilization.